Just checking it's sharing okay. Okay, we're all good to go. So, hi everybody who joins in today and watches us. Thanks for joining. I have Deborah Goodrich Royce who's joining us today. Deborah's first novel was Finding Mrs. Ford, which I've recently been reading and really enjoyed reading it. Quite a lot of twists and turns in the book, which is great. So Deborah divides her time between the Northeast and Florida, where she writes, reads, watches a lot of movies, and spends time with her family. And Deborah serves on a lot of boards, so the Avon Theatre, the American Film Institute, New York Botanical Garden, the Greenwich International Film Festival, the Greenwich Historical Society, and the Preservation Foundation of Palm Beach, the Preservation Society of Newport, and the Prasad Project. She and her husband have restored more buildings than she can count, including the Ocean House Hotel and the Deer Mountain Inn. So Deborah also holds a BA in French and Italian from the Lake Eyre College and an honorary doctorate from the same institution. In an earlier life, she was an actress in film and TV and a story editor for Miramax Films. And her second novel is Ruby Falls, which is her second psychological thriller. So thanks so much, Deborah, for joining us.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I'm wondering if you want to start off by maybe telling us a little bit about Ruby Falls.
So Ruby Falls is, I'm in front of a banner. This is my tour banner that's a little bit of the cover. Ruby Falls is a psychological thriller with Gothic tones. And when I say Gothic, I mean really like the Victorian Gothic novels we all grew up reading. I don't mean vampires and that. So it's the story of a little girl who, it begins in a cave in the mountains of Tennessee. And it is a cave called Ruby Falls, where a 6-year-old girl is there with her father in 1968. And the lights have been turned off and it's pitch black dark, and she's underground, and she can hear the waterfall falling. But of course, in the dark, she can't tell where it is. And there's a tour guide who's giving this long speech saying, and the divers have dived down and they've never been able to find the bottom. And this child is terrified because she can't tell where the water is in relationship to herself. She's holding on to her father, and her father lets go of her hand.
Oh, wow.
And the lights come back on, and he's gone. Because it's 1968, there are no credit card records, there are no cameras, there's no, the tour guides, they see this child. Obviously, she did not come into this cave alone. They don't remember who she came in with. It's a whole group of tourists. So they take her upstairs to the gift shop. They sit her on a bench for a while. Finally, they call the police. The police come and get her. And about 10 o'clock that evening, her mother, so they're a family from Michigan, which is in the north of the United States. And they're visiting family in the mountains of Tennessee, which is the south. So the mother and the aunt call the police looking for this child. They realize right about now that the child and the father are not just, out to dinner or something. The police and the mother match up the kid on the bench, and the mother and the child are grounded in this town for the remainder of the summer. The mother's dealing with the police inquisition, and the child is in a state of what we would now call shock or PTSD. 20 years later, she's an actress on a soap opera in New York. And she's gotten rid of the name Ruby. So her middle name was Ruby. So of course it's a double entendre, Ruby Falls. She's gotten rid of that name. She goes by Eleanor Russell, and she's written out of her soap opera under you don't know why, something's up. she's fired from the show. She takes off for Europe. She meets a dashing stranger whose name is Orlando Montague.
Okay.
And he's Anglo-Chinese. And he tells her the story of his parents meeting in Calcutta after World War II. His mother has, fled China. His father's British. So she marries him spontaneously. They go to Rome on a little honeymoon. They're about to go in the catacombs. And she has this pounding attack of claustrophobia after this thing that happened to her as a child. She has to be escorted up above ground. And she knows right about then she should tell Mr. Orlando Montague about what happened to her as a child, but she does not. So she begins her marriage with a secret. They move to Los Angeles. They find the perfect cottage in the Hollywood Hills, picket fence, roses, her version of an English cottage. Life is perfect. And she is cast in a remake of the Hitchcock film based on the Daphne du Maurier book, Rebecca. And as she starts to do this film, life gets strange and Orlando starts to change. He's not as nice as he seemed. And you, the reader, are way ahead of her. He has a secret or two of his own. So that is the setup of Ruby Falls.
Yeah, no, sounds great. And
it's fun.
Yeah, sounds really good. And could you tell us how you got the idea of it? Like, I notice you've got a actress in there who's a soap opera star. Is there anything from previous experiences you've had in your life, or?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you'll see at the back of the book, I'm going to hold this up. You may not be able to really see it. This is my father and me at Ruby Falls when I was a child. So my parents took me there. They did not leave me there. But, it's funny how these things, all the things you've ever done, they're in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And I wasn't planning to write this book. I'd finished Finding Mrs. Ford. I'd gotten a really good agent. Finding Mrs. Ford was on submission with publishing houses. And really the first two chapters of Ruby Falls, the one in the cave and then the one in the catacombs in Rome, it was like they downloaded into my brain and I was just taking dictation. Now, the rest of writing the book was not like that. I spent a couple of years figuring out the whole book, but I hadn't planned to write it. But when it came so clearly, I thought, I have to tell this girl's story. So that's how I got the idea. Yes, I was an actress on a soap opera, and it's that's kind of a disappeared genre in the US. We have 3 left, 3 remaining soap operas. They're all shot in Los Angeles, but the whole big industry of the New York soap opera is gone. And when I was on in the 80s,
I didn't realize
it was
that.
a big thing.
Yeah.
It was both the entry-level acting job for young actresses. I mean, Demi Moore and Meg Ryan and some of the big ones. It was also, I think, the best gig for actors who I thought were so old then, younger than I am now, in their 50s. I'm 63. So there were these actors in their 50s and 60s who had had their movie or Broadway careers. And it was a really cool job for them because they worked maybe 1 day a week. They didn't have the really hot storylines. So they were having really a grand life doing their soap opera thing. So I think it's a loss. But they're gone. Television changed with all of the reality TV and cable TV. So I wanted to write a little bit about that. And I wanted to write about Hollywood. I think Hollywood, no matter where you live in the world, you have images of Hollywood in your mind. Yeah. And with Rebecca, Manderley was a character, really. That house, the first line, I dreamt I went to Manderley again. The house loomed large in the whole book. And I wanted to utilize Hollywood in that way. We all have images of those Paramount gates or the streets of Hollywood, the Hollywood sign. So I hope I was able to do that.
And before you wrote your first book, Finding Mrs. Ford, you'd had a successful career, and obviously sounds like you're involved in a lot of things as well with all the boards and everything that you're on. What made you want to write a book?
So my transition to writing was multi-stepped. I really had a nice acting career for a decade, got married, had 2 children, and the bloom was off the rose at that point. Los Angeles is vast. This was before people could just, email you a script. And, I had 2 babies. It was the early 90s, and I'd get a call at 6 o'clock in the evening to drive an hour and pick up 2 scripts. Not a lot of fun with babies you need to put to bed. So my first husband had grown up in France, and we had the opportunity to move to Paris. So I kind of mourned my acting career, packed up for Paris, which was wonderful. And it was there. I was hired by a French film studio as a reader. All film studios keep readers on their payroll. It's a freelance job. You read either a screenplay or a novel that they're considering. You give 5 to 10 pages of a synopsis and a page of comments about what you think works and what doesn't work, and always comparisons. They always want, is this Gone with the Wind meets E.T.? What is this? So I did that in Paris. Then my first husband was hired by the actress Julia Roberts to come back to the States and run her development company with Disney. And when we moved back, we moved to New York at that point, not LA. And I was hired by Harvey Weinstein to be the story editor at Miramax Films, which is like a book editor. And we can talk a little bit about like Harvey. Like, I didn't know about his sex life, but writing thrillers, as you can see with Finding Mrs. Ford, I'm very interested in the identity, who people are, who they say they are, who they really are, because I think there's a lot of that in the world. So my transition to writing began by editing the work of other writers, really, at Miramax. Divorced, remarried, moved to Connecticut, and I was in writing groups. I was writing a lot on my own. And through the Avon Theater, this 1939 cinema that we restored out here, we became friends with the actor Gene Wilder. He lived in the town. He came to the cinema all the time. And he would do, every autumn, he would present 3 films, 2 classic films that he loved and 1 of his own. And in our friendship, we had an email correspondence, and he said to me one day, "Are you a writer? I think you're a writer." So I said, "Well, kind of." And he offered to read something I'd written, sent it to him. He was very encouraging. So I was always the quiet, secret writer. And Gene Wilder would say to me every time we'd see each other, "Are you writing? I hope you're writing." So for me, magic moment was when my youngest child left the house, grown and flown, and I felt like I got the real estate in my brain back. It was 2014, and I love my children, but it was the moment I could do that kind of deep cone of silence. And the other thing I did is I declared myself to my friends, which was a game changer for me. And I don't know if any of you here are writers. My husband was mortified. He was like, "Oh my God, don't tell people you're writing. You might not actually finish a book." But I understood that, and I was okay with being able to face that consequence. But it made a big difference for me. So that was my long transition from actress to writer. And I just finished my 3rd book now.
That's a great story. And you just said you just finished your 3rd book. When will that be out? And can you tell us anything about that at all?
I can. So when for us in the US, March 13th of 2020 was kind of this D-Day moment when everything shut down. I don't know if you in Australia shut down.
Yeah, it was very similar.
It was like, it compares to in the US, where were you when JFK was shot, or where were you when Princess Diana had her accident? There are these moments you just don't forget. So I was in Florida because I was on part of a book tour leg in Florida for Finding Mrs. Ford. And I just stayed there. We have a house there. I settled in, and I started researching something I'd been thinking about for a long time. This is true, my mother's best friend was murdered in 1948 in Pittsburgh, and it's an unsolved crime. And my mother and this girl were 12 years old when it happened. And I think there's a syndrome, which is very well known. I didn't invent it, but when people are kind of tangential to an act of extreme violence like that, it really changes them. It changed my mother. You think about the writer Dominic Dunn, his daughter was murdered in Hollywood. He became the person who profiled, the O.J. Simpson trial or the Michael Skakel trial, or now Michelle McNamara. I don't know if you've seen this, I'll Be Gone in the Dark. It was a book and a series about a serial killer in California. Anyway, it's a thing. So I've always thought about the effect that murder had on my mother and on me in a way, because my mother was very overprotective. So I started researching it. Didn't want to write it as nonfiction. They do think it was the brother. The brother was arrested multiple times. The brother is still alive. I don't really want to get into saying anything about him. It's not really what I do. So I fictionalized a writer who's researching the murder of her mother's best friend. And also, so there are two narratives. It's a book that plays out in those deep days of the pandemic in Palm Beach, Florida. And you have the narrative of a writer who's really researching and writing about murder. And you have a book within a book with its own chapters about a younger woman, a 40-year-old woman whose husband and children disappear in the pandemic, probably on a plane to Buenos Aires. And how these two stories intersect becomes, how this plays out. I just turned it in to my favorite editor. I'm anxious to hear, does it work? Because these two narratives have a very different pacing. The writer's sections are more contemplative and philosophical, and the thriller sections are a little bit more, driven. Okay. So that's that book. I'm calling it Reef Road, like coral reef. Okay. There's a street in Palm Beach called Reef Road, and it sounds to me like, Lookout Mountain or a spooky place name.
Yeah. So is it a little bit different than your last two, that it doesn't have a dual timeline?
Well,
or it does still have a bit of a...
It does a little bit. It has a dual storyline more than it has a dual timeline. But you go back, as things are playing out in March, April, May of 2020, you go back to the prior spring of 2019 to see sort of leading up to what's going on in Linda's life. She's the heroine of the story of the husband who disappears.
Yeah, no, that sounds an interesting one as well to read. Lots of books to add to our lists. We've got a few people watching, which is great. Just reminding people watching that if you have any questions, please type them in comments. I've got a question from Belinda. She says she loves the cover of Ruby Falls. She wonders if you chose or helped in designing the covers at all.
So I love that question. Thank you. Ruby Falls. So I'll hold it up for people who haven't seen it. This is done by a photographic artist by the name of Melanie Wilhide. And Melanie, she has an MFA from Yale, and she was in California doing a show. And her computer was stolen. And it took the police 3 weeks, but they found the computer, they got it back to her. And when she was trying to retrieve her body of work, that's how the photos came out. Everything is kind of sliced and diced. If you look at the face, her face is intact, but there are pieces of it that are seen in different parts of the picture. So the thief who had stolen Miss Wilhide's computer had tried to swipe it clean. So that's what happened to her work. So she created a show and she dedicated it to the thief. So her gallery show was called To Adrian Rodriguez with Love, name of her thief. And then she created new works based on that accident. And this was a new work. It's called Grace and Thorns. And it was really one of the images we were considering from the get-go. We almost went with more of a straight up floral image to coincide a little bit more with my first book, but I'm really glad we picked this. And I think
it's
the
really
look of
good.
it kind of, Ruby Falls, it's more about a girl who's in a very disintegrated state, and the cover is very reflective of that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting story then about the cover.
Yeah.
Mary wonders if you have a special place and time when you do your writing.
So I'm so lucky. I live in a house on a river. And when we bought this house, we added a little conservatory. It's right over there. You can't see it. So I don't write in my home office, which is the kitchen, which there, the phones and the bills and the papers and the dogs and the cats. I go in this conservatory where I have a huge round table and I just spread everything out, and it is really like a zone of silence. I look out at the river. It's beautiful 365 days a year, whether it's snow and ice or bright sun. And it's very Pavlovian. It's a good question because I think we are like that. We sit down in a certain spot and we're conditioned to do a certain thing. So that's really my special place. In terms of time, in pre-COVID, I do have these board commitments. I've reduced them a lot. So my schedule's a little complicated. So I would block out going 3 months forward at, 3 to 6 hour chunks for writing. Since COVID, time is with me. So I'm not as intentional about my time, but as I can see the world is inching busier again, I'll have to do that. But I do like writing in the day. I'm not a night writer.
Yeah, okay. And I'm wondering, before you wrote Finding Mrs. Ford, did you write anything else that might not have been published?
Yes, I've been writing for a long time. I have a lot of short stories. I have a screenplay that I wrote with a writing partner that we won a grant for, but we never did anything with. And I just pulled it out of a drawer. And that is more of a Black comedy. It was when my first husband left me, and it was the low point of my life. I hope it stays the low point of my life. And in this state of heartbreak, I actually had an idea. So I took the idea of Othello. So what's interesting about Othello, of course, is Desdemona hasn't had an affair, but he thinks she has.
Yeah.
So I turned that into a comedy about a woman who thinks she has the perfect life, perfect husband, perfect dog, perfect children. And she starts to suspect her husband of infidelity. And she, of course, comes completely unglued. If you think of Kristen Wiig in Bridesmaids, what was so delightful about her was her absolute bad behavior. So this woman decides she doesn't want to be a throwaway reject, has been cast off. She'll kill him. So her process for trying to kill her husband becomes increasingly absurd. That's the piece of work that I showed to Gene Wilder when he asked to see something.
Yeah.
And I think it needs a polish. I think it's a little dated, but if we could polish it up, the actresses I would picture, someone like Kristen Wiig, or did anyone see The Flight Attendant? It's a crazy series with this actress, Kelly Cuoco.
Okay, no, I haven't heard of that.
She plays an falling down alcoholic flight attendant who ends up in a Bangkok hotel on a one-night stand with somebody who's dead in the morning. And she is, a blackout. She doesn't know what happened. Anyway, an actress like that. So yes, I have some things in the drawer.
Yeah, no, to be able to write after you've been acting yourself and then to be able to write something, and that would be pretty amazing to be able to do that as well. Could you tell us what you enjoy reading yourself, and maybe if there's anything you might have read lately that you want to recommend to us?
Yeah, so some of my favorite things lately, I probably read, I'm going to say 80% fiction, 15% biography or history, and maybe 5% nonfiction, a la a Malcolm Gladwell or something. I don't read so much of that. So some of the things I really loved this year, what can be saved by Lisa Schwartz O'Halloran.
Okay.
It begins when a woman in her 50s gets a phone call, a woman in Washington, D.C., from somebody, I think it's Bangkok. And the woman says, "We have your brother." The family had lived, an American family had lived an expat life in Thailand in the 70s, and the little boy disappeared, never to be found. So all these years later, she gets this phone call. And so there are two sisters, and the one sister says, "It's ridiculous, it can't be real." But the sister who gets the phone call says, "I'm going." So off she goes to see if this is her brother. It's a very good story, but it's also really beautifully written.
Yeah,
so that's
I've read that one, and yeah, can recommend that as well. It's a good one.
You too, yeah.
Yeah.
And her turn of phrase is just so gorgeous. Another one I've read, which is more like Patricia Highsmith, like the Ripley books, is Who is Maud Dixon?
Okay.
A young writer called Alexandra something. Can't think of her last name. And that is very, very much like Patricia Highsmith. It's the main character, maybe a little bit of a sociopath, but
Okay.
The story is the assistant to a famous writer who writes under a pseudonym and no one knows who she is. They're in Morocco and the writer disappears. And it's the assistant's chance maybe to step in to her place. And does she, can she, will she? So it's a fun setup. So that's in the thriller genre. Another book I'm enjoying, a new writer called Joni Elliott, and it's called The Audacity of Sarah Grayson. And that similarly, it's not about a sociopath, but a famous writer dies and leaves in her will the instructions that the final part of her wildly successful series needs to be written by her daughter. So it's the daughter in her 30s. It's really delightful, charming. Can she write the way her mother wrote? What are some others? So I read a lot. I definitely read a lot.
Yeah. And what about research for your books? Do you read a lot for that, or how do you go about your research?
I do, in fact. So you've read Finding Mrs. Ford, and for those who haven't, that is the story of a woman whose past catches up with her. It's a woman in her mid-50s. She lives in a gorgeous seaside resort on the coast of the Atlantic. And one day in August of 2014, the FBI shows up at her door to ask her about an Iraqi Chaldean man. She claims she doesn't know him. And they say, well, that's a little bit funny because he took a plane from Baghdad to Boston, and we picked him up in a car on his way to your house. And you go back to 1979, Detroit, when Detroit was really declining, as many northern industrial American cities were. She's a college student, takes a summer job in a nice ladies' boutique, and meets a wild child, Annie, who convinces her to go get a job at a very seedy discotheque where there are a lot of Iraqi Chaldean men. The Chaldeans are Christians from the north of Iraq. There are a lot of them in Detroit. And the August of 2014 moment when the FBI shows up, it's right when ISIS is marching across the north of Iraq, killing a lot of people, including a lot of Chaldeans. So that book is sort of the unpeeling of the secret she's hiding. So yeah, I researched the Chaldeans heavily. I'm from Detroit originally. I knew some Chaldeans in Detroit. It's sort of an obscure population. I heavily researched it. And it's tricky, you know, in the US right now, we have a huge conversation going about cultural appropriation. Who gets to tell whose story? I would never dream of making a main character an Iraqi Chaldean man. That would be too hard for me to write. But he's really the third character down. And after all the research I did, I thought, well, I mean, if I try to write just a real man. Anyway, I've heard from some Iraqi Chaldeans in Detroit, and they like the book. So that's a big relief.
Good. Yeah,
but yeah, I researched that. Or with Ruby Falls, our actress Eleanor Ruby Russell. She becomes obsessed with why her father would ditch her that way in 1968. So she researches the conspiracies of the era. And in the US, they really dealt around the JFK assassination. That was the doozy that we had. So she goes down these rabbit holes about the KGB and the CIA and, were the Cubans involved? Or there was this thing, and I read 2 books about it called the Dixie Mafia, which I'd never heard of, but it's a syndicated crime group with hillbillies.
Yeah.
That's sort of what it is. But yeah, I research all that. I try to make, I think I love fiction that has something of a true historical underpinning. I don't write historical fiction, but the stuff I put in it is true.
Yeah. And when you've been doing your research and that, is there something that you've found that really, really surprised you that you could share with us?
Oh, well, the Dixie Mafia was a surprise to me. I did not know that existed. I'd never heard of it. I always, in the US, we have historically associated organized crime with Italian Americans, but it turns out, there are all kinds of organized crime groups, and it's including the Dixie Mafia. So that was a surprise to me.
Yeah. Mary's wondering if you have writer friends which you support each other.
Absolutely. That's such a good question, Mary. I find the writer community to be the kindest, warmest, most generous community.
Yeah,
so I'm friends with Beatrice Williams. She writes a lot of historical fiction. I don't know if you've read her, but she's delightful. I'm friends with Luann Rice now. She has 2 thrillers that go together. One called Last Day and one called Shadow Box. Terrific books. Yeah, and just maybe some people you might not know as well, but it's a generous community. There's a feeling, I think, in writers that a rising tide floats all boats. Sometimes in certain worlds, I love that term, scarcity mentality. There's some people have a feeling that there's just this pie, and if I'll either get one slice or you'll get one slice, but we can't both have the same slice. I don't find that with writers at all.
Yeah, and so that's interesting, because I've found writers all over the world saying similar to what you're saying, which surprised me at first, but seems to be common. Yeah. Mary's also wondering if you read your reviews.
Mary, good question. So, yes, I do. And the problem with that, of course, as addictive as the good reviews are, boy, the bad reviews are brutal. And it's a reminder that, you have to write what you write, do the best you can, put it out there. And there are going to be people who get it. And boy, that feels good when someone really understands what you're trying to say, but there are people who don't. So there are writers who don't read the reviews, and maybe I will develop into one of those because, boy, the bad reviews, you think, ew.
Yeah. And could you tell us what you think for yourself makes a good story?
Well, I love a good plot. I love good twists and turns, whether it's in the guise of a thriller or not. I love story twists that surprise me, or let me say stories that are kind of revealed in beautifully paced increments. And I love well-developed characters. I love a sense of place. The places I write, whether it's Palm Beach or Watch Hill or Detroit or Los Angeles, I know those places. I go to those places. I go back. I was on an airplane to Singapore, and I was reading The Shadow of the Wind, the Spanish novel set in Barcelona. And I've never been to Barcelona. And it was so addictive to me thinking about, I just love when a writer gives you a window on a place that you either recognize or don't.
Yeah. That's very true. And when you were a child, were you a big reader as a child?
I was an only child.
What sort of things did you like reading?
What is the one, the English books like The Secret Garden,
Oh,
and
yes, yeah.
loved that
Yeah.
book.
Mm,
And then growing up to, uh, Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights and The Woman in White and Anna Karenina, all those books. And then eventually, the Jane Austen books, and just, those were the things that I just couldn't get enough of.
yeah. And could you tell people watching how they can keep in touch with you, like what social media you have? And
Absolutely. So I have Instagram is my most active social media, and I think that's just Deborah Royce.
okay.
I'm on Facebook and I'm on Twitter and on LinkedIn too, but Instagram I'm most active. I have a website which is DeborahGoodrichRoyce.com, and that I list, engagements that I'm doing and reviews, and you can actually reach me to have me come to book clubs through my website. You can also direct message me on Instagram or Facebook.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, and thanks so much for joining us. It's been great chatting to you, and thanks for everyone else who joined in and the questions that people asked. Look forward to reading more of your books.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy this Saturday.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Okay. Bye. Thank you.